What if a single glance could shatter everything you believed in, your marriage, your friendships, and your own sense of self? Lucia is about to find out just how fragile her world truly is when she spots a little boy with a hauntingly familiar gaze roaming the family estate. The Montenegro estate shimmered under the glow of lanterns and ornate lights as the family prepared to celebrate the wedding anniversary of Esteban's parents. Guests in elegant attire strolled across the manicured lawns, mingling under the stars. Lucia, Esteban's wife, had grown accustomed to the grandeur of these events, but a certain anxious energy buzzed in the air tonight. While searching for Esteban among the crowd, Lucia took a detour through a quieter corridor, hoping to catch her breath before rejoining the festivities. That was when she noticed a young boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, standing by the staircase quietly folding a paper airplane. Nothing should have seemed unusual about a child at a family party, yet something in his expression made her pulse quicken. His eyes, dark and intense, reminded her of her husband. His gentle smile had a touch of warmth that was oddly reminiscent of her longtime best friend, Paola. A shiver coursed through Lucia as their gazes met. The boy offered her a timid wave before darting away, disappearing into the crowd. Moments later, she ran into her mother-in-law, Carmen, whose frosty greeting jolted Lucia back to reality. Carmen brushed aside any mention of the boy, insisting everything was going smoothly and ushering Lucia toward the party's main area. Despite Carmen's dismissal, Lucia couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was off. After scanning the crowd unsuccessfully for the mysterious child, she finally found Esteban. He was deep in conversation with a group of business associates. When she attempted to ask him about the boy, Esteban seemed genuinely puzzled and redirected the topic, distracted by looming business deals. As the night went on, Lucia's thoughts kept returning to the child's familiar features. Could it be a distant cousin, a nephew she'd never met? She pushed the questions to the back of her mind, yet the unease wouldn't leave her. Little did she know that brief, uncanny encounter was the first crack in the foundation of her life. One that would soon threaten to bring her world crashing down. The celebration continued in full swing, but Lucia couldn't relax. Even the lively music and glittering decor couldn't distract her from that nagging sense of unease. She searched the estate for any sign of the little boy, hoping to prove to herself that her initial suspicions had been a simple misunderstanding. While wandering through the garden, she finally spotted Paola, her childhood best friend and closest confidant, standing near a fountain. Under normal circumstances, Lucia would have greeted her with a warm hug and endless chatter. Yet something about Paola's posture, rigid shoulders, restless hands made her think twice. When Lucia approached, Paola offered a fleeting smile, but quickly looked away. Her usual lighthearted demeanor had vanished, replaced by nervous energy. Before Lucia could ask any real questions, Paola mumbled something about having to leave early and hurried off. Lucia stood rooted in place, her mind racing. Why would Paola abruptly cut their conversation short? And why did her behavior mirror the same strange tension Lucia felt ever since encountering that mysterious boy? Determined to put her worries to rest, Lucia found Esteban once more, pulling him aside to ask if Paola might be upset about something. But Esteban, distracted by his father's business associates, brushed off her concerns with a vague reassurance. He promised they would discuss everything later, but the look in his eyes told Lucia there was more he wasn't saying. Unable to find answers and burdened by growing doubts, Lucia felt a cold weight settling in the pit of her stomach. Although the party glimmered around her, she sensed that the elaborate facade of the Montenegro family might be hiding deeper secrets. Secrets that could unravel her entire life if she dared to look too closely. 2 days later, a surprise announcement shook Lucia out of her routine. Don Francisco, Esteban's father, had summoned the entire family to a meeting in the estate's ornate library. The summons was urgent and non-negotiable, delivered by an anxious household staff who offered no further explanation. Lucia, dreading the worst, arrived at the appointed time with her heart pounding. Inside, the atmosphere felt charged. Dim light filtered through tall windows draped in crimson curtains. Esteban stood by a massive desk, his expression grim. In one corner sat Paola, eyes downcast, and next to her was the same little boy Lucia had glimpsed on the staircase. Licenciado Ferrer, the family lawyer, was also present, poring over a stack of documents. Carmen and the rest of the Montenegros maintained a tense silence. Don Francisco cleared his throat, commanding everyone's attention. In a voice sharper than Lucia had ever heard from him, he explained that anonymous letters had arrived at the estate. Letters that hinted at a hidden child linked to the Montenegro bloodline. Determined to protect the family name, he'd investigated in secret and obtained a DNA test. The results, he said, were conclusive. Lucia clenched her fists, fearing the words that were about to spill from Don Francisco's mouth. An echo of her earlier suspicions reverberated in her mind. Those familiar eyes, that uneasy glance from Paula. The test proves, Don Francisco announced solemnly, that this boy David is Esteban's son. A thunderous silence descended. Lucia's breath caught in her throat, and she could scarcely process what she had just heard. She saw the boy clinging to Paula's sleeve. Paula's face was streaked with tears, yet she remained motionless. Esteban stared at Lucia, anguish etched into his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but managed only a broken whisper. I didn't know. Rage, confusion, and heartbreak collided in Lucia's chest. Her world felt as though it were caving in, the betrayal turning her blood to ice. The hush in the library was almost unbearable as all eyes fell on her, waiting for her reaction. But Lucia could only stand there, stunned, her reality unraveling one devastating secret at a time. The moment the news sank in, the library burst into an uproar. Carmen Montenegro unleashed a torrent of accusations against Paula, calling her a schemer who had ensnared her son for money and prestige. Paula, eyes brimming with tears, could do little more than stammer a weak denial, insisting she'd never intended to deceive anyone. Lucia stood frozen in the midst of it all, her mind reeling. Esteban's frantic attempts to approach her only deepened her sense of betrayal. In the cacophony of raised voices, Don Francisco tried to restore order, hammering a heavy palm on the mahogany desk. He demanded that Esteban take responsibility for his actions and that Paula reveal why she had kept David a secret for so long. While Paula clung protectively to her son, Esteban admitted his single night lapse had happened years ago during a rocky period in his relationship with Lucia. He'd never imagined it could result in a child, and Paula, fearing the wrath of both the Montenegros and her best friend, had remained silent. Lucia's vision blurred as she processed this devastating truth. Her husband and her closest friend had formed a bond behind her back, leaving her to play the unwitting fool. She pushed past Esteban, sprinting out of the library, tears hot against her cheeks. Her every sense felt bombarded by questions she was too afraid to answer. Could she ever forgive him? Was her marriage over? Did she even know these people anymore? Or herself? Still gathered in the library, the Montenegros swarmed in confusion. Behind them, the child, David, stared wide-eyed at the adults, his paper airplane forgotten on the floor. Even at his young age, he sensed that nothing in these walls would ever be the same again. Lucia escaped to the far side of the estate, stumbling out onto a terrace overlooking the manicured gardens. She pressed her palms against the balustrade, gulping in the evening air to keep herself from collapsing under the weight of what she had just learned. Though tears kept threatening to surface, a strange, numb shock held them at bay. Looking out at the flickering lanterns dotting the garden, she wondered bitterly if the Montenegro family's carefully curated image mattered more to them than her own heartbreak. She soon found out the answer was, in many ways, yes. Moments later, Don Francisco approached, voice measured yet unyielding. His main concern was not the betrayal Lucia felt, but rather the scandal of having an unacknowledged grandchild. He insisted that Esteban do the right thing, which, to him, meant formally accepting David into the family fold, and by extension, saving the Montenegro reputation from irreparable harm. As if on cue, Carmen emerged from the house, fixing Lucia with an accusing glare. To her, Paula was the villain, and Lucia was complicit for not having sensed something was wrong sooner. Esteban stood behind his parents, visibly torn. He tried to approach Lucia, but Don Francisco signaled him back, pleading for discretion until the immediate crisis passed. In that moment, Lucia realized how alone she truly was. She felt like a pawn in a family game, where appearances and business ties overshadowed the raw pain she carried in her chest. Without waiting for them to finish, she retreated down the terrace steps and made her way around the side of the estate, determined to hold on to the last bit of dignity and independence that remained hers. Lucia spent the next few few days away from the Montenegro estate, taking refuge at her aunt's modest home in the city. Although the apartment was small and the view unremarkable, it felt like a sanctuary in comparison to the looming walls and endless corridors of the estate. Each morning she woke with a start, hoping the revelations of the past days had been nothing more than a nightmare. Yet reality always came rushing back. Esteban had fathered a child with her best friend, Paula. Afternoon, Esteban appeared at her aunt's doorstep. His eyes were bloodshot and his posture slumped with remorse. Lucia, torn between anger and concern, stepped aside to let him in. They sat across from each other in a cramped living room, a palpable tension filling the silence. Finally, Esteban began to speak. He told her he had distanced himself from the family business and confronted Paula about why she had chosen secrecy for so long. His words tumbled out in halting admissions of guilt, fear, and regret. Lucia listened, arms wrapped protectively around her knees. Every explanation felt like a fresh wound, but part of her couldn't deny the heartbreak etched on Esteban's face. He insisted he still loved her, that his mistake with Paula had been a lapse in judgment made during a low point in their relationship. There was no rehearsed pitch or rehearsed apology, only raw desperation. Yet even as she sensed sincerity in his voice, Lucia's own pain remained as heavy as ever. The doubts that haunted her. Did he truly not suspect a child existed? Would she forever be tied to Paula through his son? Hovered like unanswered questions in the space between them. For the first time, Lucia allowed herself to cry openly, mourning the life they had shared, now in pieces at her feet. No sooner had Esteban left than Paula appeared at Lucia's aunt's apartment. She arrived unannounced, her eyes rimmed with guilt. Lucia's heart hammered as she opened the door, torn between the burning anger of betrayal and the ghost of a friendship they once shared. For a moment, they stood in awkward silence, each waiting for the other to speak. Paula was the first to break. Her voice trembled as she recounted how that single night with Esteban occurred during one of the couple's temporary breakups. She had never intended to destroy Lucia's marriage, and when she realized she was pregnant, she had panicked, fearing the Montenegro's disapproval, and perhaps even more, Lucia's devastation. Lucia listened, arms crossed over her chest, fighting to keep her composure. Each of Paula's words confirmed the painful timeline of their betrayal. She wanted to scream, to demand how her best friend could have let her remain in the dark for so long. Yet what she saw in Paula's eyes was genuine remorse, not a cynical plot for wealth or status. Still, forgiveness felt out of reach. Instead of hugging her friend, Lucia quietly asked her to leave. As Paola turned away, Lucia caught a glimpse of the immense sadness in her face, echoing the turmoil roiling in her own heart. Despite everything, they both loved Esteban, and now they both had to confront the impossibility of returning to the life they once knew. In the midst of Lucia's turmoil, new revelations arose. Don Francisco's private investigator discovered that the anonymous letters revealing David's existence had been sent by none other than Carmen, Esteban's own mother. Outraged Don Francisco confronted her, demanding to know her reasons. Carmen confessed she had orchestrated the scandal in hopes of driving Lucia away. She believed her son's wife wasn't of a suitable background to carry the Montenegro name. When Lucia learned the truth, a cold anger crept through her veins. It wasn't enough that she had been betrayed by her husband and her best friend. Now she realized her mother-in-law had deliberately pulled the strings to shatter her marriage. Carmen, typically so regal and imposing, found herself banished from the estate temporarily by a furious Don Francisco who believed she had jeopardized the entire family's image. Yet Lucia felt no relief. If anything, Carmen's complicity only deepened her disillusionment with the Montenegros. They weren't just a powerful family, they were a family that would sacrifice anyone, even loved ones, to protect their own sense of grandeur. Seeing Esteban torn between loyalty to his parents and genuine remorse for what had happened, Lucia questioned if there was any future for them at all. Esteban, pushed to his breaking point, decided to distance himself from the Montenegro business empire. He moved out of the estate and rented a modest apartment in the city, hoping that a dose of independence would help him prove his sincerity. To Lucia. Meanwhile, Paula minimized contact, focusing on caring for David and ensuring his childhood remained as unaffected as possible. Lucia, still harboring deep hurt and anger, noticed the lengths Esteban was going to. He stopped accepting his father's money, worked extra hours as a freelance financial consultant, and, perhaps most importantly, took on the role of father to David despite the painful circumstances. Slowly, his devotion to his son and the humility in his interactions with Lucia began to chip away at her hardened heart. They began meeting in cafes or in parks, places devoid of the Montenegro drama. In these quiet corners of the city, Lucia saw flashes of the man she had once loved wholeheartedly. He owned his mistakes, never making excuses for what he had done. In time, she allowed herself to envision a path toward healing, though she made no promises. Forgiveness, after all, is rarely immediate. It's a process, forged in honest conversations and new boundaries that must be respected. Months passed, and with them came a cautious reconciliation. Lucia agreed to see a couples therapist with Esteban, not out of naive optimism, but rather a genuine desire to see if there was still a life they could build together. Through difficult sessions, they examined the fractures in their marriage, the break in trust, the interference of family, and how secrets had festered for too long. In parallel, Lucia started rebuilding her own sense of identity. She took on more responsibilities at work, spent time with supportive friends, and found solace in simple routines. Esteban, meanwhile, balanced his freelance projects with parental duties, introducing David into his life in a way that didn't ignore Lucia's pain. Though she still found it hard to face Paula, she gradually accepted that David was innocent, a child who deserved warmth rather than resentment. On a late afternoon, Esteban and Lucia stood side by side on the small balcony of his rented apartment. The city lights began to flicker against the purple dusk. Neither spoke, yet the silence felt different, less fraught with tension and more at peace. Somewhere in that quiet moment, Lucia understood she might never fully forget the betrayal, but she could learn to live with it, to grow beyond it, and maybe even to love again without constantly looking over her shoulder. What they were building now was not a perfect fairy tale, but something stronger and more honest. A relationship built on acknowledgement of flaws and a mutual promise to strive for something better. And for the first time in a long while, Lucia felt the stirrings of genuine hope.